combined initiative of customized energy solution and clean energy access network, which takes you deep into the world of energy innovations and sustainable solutions shaping our future. I'm your host, Muskan, and today we have a special guest who is at the forefront of promoting decentralized renewable energy within the context of climate action at the UNDP. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Natarajan. Hari has been instrumental in driving initiatives that integrate DRE technologies into sustainable development frameworks, helping to create resilient and empowered communities worldwide. Hari, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself and tell our audience about your role in climate action?
Thanks, Muskan. Thank you very much to both Clean and Customized Energy Solutions for having me here on this podcast. So I'm a program specialist at UNDP India, and I lead the climate pillar under the Action for Climate and Environment unit at UNDP. So the climate pillar has a number of initiatives looking at aspects of climate reporting against our international commitments, looking at thermal comfort, where we work with the Bureau of Energy Efficiency at the Ministry of Power. We are looking at just transition in the context of a subnational government. We are looking at South-South collaboration in terms of working with the International Solar Alliance to promote solar water pumping solutions in developing countries in Africa and the Pacific Islands. And last but not least, we are also looking at working in the space of decentralized renewable energy for livelihood. We are working at two levels. At the national level, we are working with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy and supporting them in exploring the convergence opportunities between the policy framework of MNRE and the schemes and policies of other ministries such as Ministry of Agriculture, Rural Development, Tribal Affairs, etc. At the subnational level, we are working with different government agencies across a few states in India to try and demonstrate the potential of such DRE livelihood solutions. And over the next year or so, we are going to be focusing on exploring the business case for such solutions, and also based on that, try and see how we can raise funding through international climate finance for end-user financing of such DRE livelihood solutions. So we cover a broad range of work, but DRE for livelihoods is an important component of the work that we do here, and we have fairly ambitious plans on how we'd like to take this forward over the next 5 years or so.
It's great to have you with us, and thank you for sharing about what you do. So I would like to understand your perspective on how DRE can contribute to livelihoods within the broader framework of climate action.
Yeah, so I think I'd split that answer in a few different buckets. I think firstly, when we look at energy access in the country today, we've been able to extend the grid and provide household level energy access to a large part of our country. Over the last 5 to 8 years especially, it has been a fairly aggressive push to assure 100% household electrification. But we have still not been able to provide affordable, reliable and clean energy solutions for livelihood activities, especially in rural areas. And I think decentralized renewable energy has a huge role to play here. The other element that you look at is from the climate perspective. So we have very ambitious targets in terms of moving away from fossil fuels and opting towards low carbon transition pathways. However, a lot of our focus when measuring progress is looking at some of the large capacity projects that are being established across the country. But I personally believe that DRE solutions also has a huge role to play. And if we are able to make that transition in rural areas, as the demand for energy increases in these areas, if we are able to directly leapfrog and provide them such energy access through decentralized renewable energy solutions, then we've already solved the puzzle, and they have a fair bit of potential to contribute to our climate change, in terms of energy transition commitments in the international fora.
Okay. So basically, conversation around renewable energy and climate change often emphasizes large installations like, windmills or solar PV. Why do you think the potential of DRE is being overlooked, and what actions should stakeholders or sector stakeholders for that matter take to change the narrative that has been going on for a while now?
So I think it's obvious for the larger project, a lot of the processes are a lot easier. You are not directly engaging with the end user, but you are entering into contracts with the distribution companies, and that's been facilitated through a centralized agency like the Solar Energy Corporation of India. So when your policy ecosystem is very clear and the government priorities also have that ambitious target, they are then able to attract private sector investment, and private sector is willing to come in because they see a significant potential for return. When we look at decentralized renewable energy solutions, we are primarily looking at a customer segment which is very different. Firstly, we are engaging with the end user, and when we are promoting these solutions for rural areas, then we are working with an end user whose credit history is not very strong, who doesn't have the necessary linkages to financial institutions to get a loan to finance such a solution. So any enterprise which is entering this space to try and address this gap through clean energy solutions for livelihood has to really not just look at their own business and how to grow it, but are also having to solve a lot of the ecosystem issues which are not being addressed. So there isn't a buy-in from the end user. So the end user is not demanding for these solutions, but it's more like a supply push where you're trying to convince the customer that they should use the solution and it's useful for them. And for the end user on the ground, the climate argument is not too strong. They are really looking at the economic value of such a transaction. And so unless you are able to establish that business case, the end user is not going to be convinced to adopt the solution. Then once you've done that, you need to, because these solutions are not necessarily small enough for an individual user, you will need to get some kind of end user financing for this. Engagement with financial institutions is again the next hurdle, because you need to, convince the lender first on the credit worthiness of the customer. But even if the banker already understands the credit worthiness of the customer, there is a perceived risk around the technology. There's not enough examples around the country today for us to be able to say that this is a reliable technology, this will work well, and so it's a bankable project, and therefore the end user has sufficient returns to be able to repay the loan, or the debt service coverage is sufficient, and therefore there will not be a default. So this is an other level of the ecosystem that you need to address. The third, which is a big challenge, again, comes from the fact that a lot of the enterprises which are promoting these solutions are relatively early stage enterprises, do not have the necessary scale or bandwidth to offer after-sales support across the country. So there is that level of uncertainty as well, which brings in a lot of resistance to adopt these solutions. In fact, any conversation that you would have with a stakeholder today who's not active in this space, the first comment is around the after-sales service aspect and how the sector is going to address this. So I think this is where entities like Clean, which is the industry body representing all the such enterprises, need to build that confidence level among the stakeholders to say that these are solutions which are reliable, bankable, enterprises are strong enough to provide the after-sales support. And once we create a bundle of evidence and not just anecdote, we can take that message then to a policymaker and say, okay, here is something that is working well. We have achieved a certain degree of scale and demonstrated that everything works well. Now you need to incorporate this practice into policy and facilitate the large-scale replication of such initiatives. So I think the overall ecosystem support is required, and it's not necessarily just the role of an agency like Clean or the enterprises to take this burden. I think part of the responsibility here is also on the developmental agencies such as UNDP, GIZ, etc., to create support to build this ecosystem. And there is a fair bit of effort going on, but it's work in progress. And hopefully 5 years down the road, we would have seen significant progress.
Definitely. So I would like to ask ask you that since you mentioned so many things about it, what are the key opportunities and hurdles in widespread adoptions of, DRE technology for livelihood specifically?
So I think as far as I'm concerned, based on the assessment that we've done on opportunities for convergence, the best way for the sector to grow fast is to piggyback on these convergence opportunities. And I think one of the biggest ministries that we need to focus on is the Ministry of Rural Development, which operates both the State Rural Livelihood Mission and also, the equivalent National Urban Livelihood Mission, which is under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Now, if we are able to look at the livelihoods which are being promoted on the ground and look at how DRE solutions can be integrated into that, I think that's the largest network that we have today in the country. And if we are able to showcase or demonstrate that our solutions work well, scaling up across the country is going to be relatively easy. There are several similar opportunities with other departments. For instance, Ministry of Agriculture, looking at, again, post-harvest management solutions. Then there is opportunity in Ministry of Animal Husbandry and Fisheries. So there are a lot of rural livelihood-centric activities where DRE solutions have a role to play, and we have existing solutions which can be scaled up quickly. Now, the other aspect of it, which is a struggle, is oftentimes you have enterprises providing a solution to address one part of a value chain, and the ability of the sector to address all aspects of the value chain and offer solutions is probably something that is missing, and it's not something that's going to be achieved easily either. So this is one major hurdle. I think the other major hurdle is also the element of financing. I think unless there is end user financing that is freely available, a lot of these solutions are far too expensive to be adopted on an upfront cost basis by most of the end users. Again, the opportunity here is to see whether we can identify collectives, SHGs, FPOs, etc., where collectively they are able to still cover the cost of such a solution. But I still think that will still be a very small fraction of the market. And what is really needed is to look at sufficient end user financing that flows into the sector. And this is something that UNDP is looking at closely to see how we can come up with a solution for this, especially tapping into international climate finance that's available for this purpose. The other aspect which needs to be addressed is really creating an ecosystem for providing after-sales support. And I think that is a big hurdle, and therefore there is a huge element of skill building that is required on the ground in order to make this work. And again, here under the National Skill Development Mission and under the Sector Skill Council for Green Jobs, there have been courses such as Surya Mitra, which are focused primarily on solar energy, 3-month course which has been established, and there are training institutes offering that. How do we integrate the larger solutions which are relevant for livelihood applications is one part that we need to look at. And then even within this, how do you create those opportunities for employment once people go through this training process? I think that is still a missing link. So people do not opt for such training because they don't see the opportunities for employment once they train. So there is that element of the market also that needs to be addressed. I'm sure I'm missing several other hurdles because it is still a fairly nascent sector. But I think this is two of the major things that I can point out. And maybe the third one that I can talk about is the fact that livelihoods covers a wide spectrum of activities in the country. And I think we have solutions for a very small fraction of those livelihoods. So there are still several applications that can be developed, and there is probably a need for risk capital, R&D, to support R&D to come up with new solutions and so on. That is also something which is not very easily accessible, and most enterprises have to invest their own resources and bootstrap to address this gap. But if we had more easy access to risk capital to do this, that would also, I think, be another useful, thing to have in place.
That's great. So, what are the general trends that are observed globally regarding DRE, both in developed and developing countries when it comes to livelihood?
My experience has been largely in India, but based on what little I understand, I'm going to try and comment on it. So I think in the developed country context, a lot of the economic activity is relatively formalized. And when they talk about decentralized solutions as well, it comes from a very different context where they're all by and large connected to the grid. And you're looking at, localized smart grids which, use renewable energy based on the potential available in that area to increase flexibility and reliability of the energy services. And we are quite far away from that. In India as well, there was a fairly ambitious push to have mini grids, and I think there are a couple of private players who are still banking heavily on mini grids. But somewhere mini grids business model has not yet evolved very strongly in the country, and there are still some gaps in terms of the utilization of the energy that's coming from the mini grid, integration of the mini grid into the larger grid, and the regulatory hurdles around that. Again, my information is a little dated on this, and I'm sure there's been progress made, but we've not still really had a big focus on these decentralized mini grids which integrate very well with a larger electricity grid in the country. In the developing country context, I think there is a lot of work that's happening in this space, but to the extent that I understand, India is still seen as one of the leaders in this space. And I think there's a huge opportunity for our sector under the South-South collaboration to take some of our solutions to other geographies, adapt them to the local context, and then, see how we can scale this up. And India is already a test bed for such experimentation because India is not a uniform country. Even solutions which have been developed for southern India have not worked very well in the northeast and have had to be adapted for it to be successful. The same if you take it to the northern region, may require some other customization. So there is already an understanding of the need for DRE solutions for livelihoods to be customized to the local geographies. And therefore, this experience can be taken as a part of our South-South collaboration to several developing countries, especially in, sub-Saharan Africa, but even the larger African context, I would think so. So this is where, the partnership that UNDP has with the International Solar Alliance allows us to try and do this in terms of taking solutions to developing countries elsewhere. We, within the UNDP family, have now been having discussions with several countries in Africa. Kenya comes to mind, Namibia, and even in the South Asian context with Sri Lanka, where there is a lot of demand for last mile farm gate level cold storage solutions, for example. So there is a recognition that India has made significant progress on at least the technology solutions available for livelihoods. The big case obviously differs from country to country. And this is where, if we're smart, a lot of our enterprises would be able to also export some of these solutions to other developing countries, which will help these enterprises grow as well. Yeah.
So what do you think are the major issues that are hindering the implementation and the large scale adoption of DRE in India and especially global South?
I will again speak specifically from the Indian context. I think oftentimes when we've engaged with government officials and we tell them, listen, DRE has a role to play, their immediate response is, okay, what kind of support are you looking for? And usually our stories are such that we're looking for very small amounts of support, which then immediately, they lose interest in that because they're looking at a widespread scaled up program with a significant outlay. For example, the recently announced Surya Ghar scheme, right? A major outlay. So I think what we often get wrong as a sector, the DRE space, is that we often go with anecdotes or case studies of what has worked and impact, but we are not talking about business models. We are not talking about scale. We are not talking about widespread impact. And I think this is the story that we as a sector need to create in order to address some of the policy policy level support that we require for such programs to be scaled up. Even on the integration piece or the convergence piece that we're talking about. Oftentimes when you go to a ministry which is not dealing with energy, they will tell us they want a clear blueprint of what the solution is and then how do you scale it up. And we are still talking in the language that these solutions need to be customized as per requirement on the ground. And so the customization versus scaling up of a cookie cutter approach of scale up, there is again a mismatch there. And finally, we have not been able to come up with strong bankable project arguments to say that these can be funded by end users this can be funded for end users and there is a business case for it. I think this particular messaging also needs to come out a lot more clearly. And even if you look back at the whole solar home system revolution that happened in the country, it took a long and consistent engagement with financial institutions before it got integrated into government policy, and then through the financial institutions which provided end user financing for solar home systems. And there, at least, it was fairly standardized. You had different sizes of household energy systems. But when you talk about livelihoods, now there is no standard solution that is applicable to all livelihoods. You're talking about a diverse set of livelihoods under textiles, under farm-based activity, under fisheries, under agriculture, and then you have different capacities of the solutions that are required. So the permutations and combinations of the solutions that we're talking about are enormous, and therefore it again makes it very difficult for a policymaker or a financier to understand this. So I think the onus is also on us as a sector to be able to cut this down into a clear matrix of solutions and capacities which are easily understood by both policymakers as well as financiers, and then move to create bankable project documents which then will be financed by end users. MNRE itself has initiated the process around this, where they've said that they've identified 5 technologies which are relatively mature and are amenable to be scaled up, and so they're coming up with standards. That's another important element. So the minute you talk to a line ministry or line department, they are also looking for clear technical specifications on the basis of which they can do tendering. Now, technical specifications again are not standardized or available today for the sector. So this is another piece of work that we think over a period of 5 years to 8 years, as the sector starts maturing for different livelihood solutions, you will also start seeing clear technical specifications which are standardized and therefore is easily understood by a financier and can then be scaled up.
Again, what I want to know, one more thing, can DRE for livelihoods be a crucial component for India's roadmap towards carbon neutrality, and if yes, how can it be effectively integrated?
So I think you mean a net zero target by 2070,
Yeah.
And on the shorter term we also have SDG targets until 2030. So a lot of our work, and there's a lot of conversation around this on how to look at this short-term targets until 2030 and how do you then integrate it into the longer-term targets until 2070. To be honest with you, a lot of the focus today is until 2030, and there's not really much clarity on what the roadmap or the decarbonization pathways are beyond 2030 all the way until 2050, 2060, 2070. Internationally, again, I think there's a lot of push for India to move forward the target of net zero, because most of the developed countries are focused on 2050 or even sooner, and because we are the third largest emitter, although per capita emissions are much lower, we therefore are beginning to contribute to the emissions problem, and therefore if we are able to look at net zero much earlier, then there is a positive impact for the world as a whole, because from a population perspective, we are 1/7 the total population of the world. Now, does DRE have a role to play in this? Absolutely, because there is as I said, our per capita emissions are low because our per capita energy consumption in general is significantly lower than the world average. Now, even if we add an efficiency layer to it, we still need to grow significantly on our per capita energy consumption. And a lot of this growth will come about from economic activity in rural areas. And there's a huge latent demand for energy services in rural areas. Now, if we are able to move that to decentralized renewable energy, you've already leapfrogged, the layer of getting energy access through the grid, which is based on fossil fuels, but you're directly moving them into a clean energy transition pathway. So even though individually impact is going to be very small, collectively, if you look at rural India, the impact towards net zero is going to be huge. Now, it comes again back to that same argument. As a government, our policies are largely looking at centralized solutions because they are much easier to promote. And there is a huge transaction cost which is involved in promoting these decentralized renewable energy solutions, especially in the context that the ecosystem for promoting them in rural areas doesn't exist today. And I think that is where there is a role for a lot of the agencies, including Clean, to kind of build that narrative on why there is value in aggressively promoting decentralized renewable energy solutions. The fact that it also adds to your climate resilience, where local communities are in charge of their energy services and are in control of their energy services and therefore are much more resilient to any, major events. So I think there is a lot of co-benefits that would come from decentralized renewable energy far beyond just the energy service provision itself. But there is a huge effort needed across all aspects of that of the sector for this to translate into reality. How do we convince the government that this is the pathway to take is, I think, the other important piece of the puzzle. And there again, it comes back to the same thing. Unless we are able to create very strong evidence on the impact on environment, impact on social aspects, impact on economic aspects from DRE solutions, unless we are able to create that narrative and show that this works at scale, we will not be able to convince the government. So building that narrative, I think, is the most pressing need for the sector today. And Clean to some extent contributes to that already by coming out with the state of the sector report. But I think we need to improve on that annual report significantly to be able to create that, large evidence-based narrative on the impact of DRE solutions, and then also find an effective means of conveying this to the government and influencing policy to some extent around this.
And how do you think we can build interest and confidence of DRE sector players among, planners and policy makers regarding the potential of DRE for livelihoods?
I think one of the things that we are attempting, I think the biggest challenge often in the work that we do is that a lot of the efforts are unfortunately in silos. Different players doing different interventions, but not necessarily coming together as a collective and, looking at how do we collectively work together to create greater impact on the ground and also to be able to then build that narrative to convince policymakers. And I think here Clean has a very strong role to play as the industry representative, and then also working with other partners such as UNDP, GIZ, CEW. There are several players who are fairly active in this space. GAP is another new entrant in the space. Gogla is another agency that's working in the space. So how do we actually bring them all together so that a single narrative across all these partners is then transferred to the other stakeholders, important stakeholders in the sector? And if there is a consistent message that goes for the sector to all these other stakeholders, I think we will be able to influence them better. Today, I think there are different players taking different messages, which then tend to confuse the government. And we are also not able to show that story of impact across the sector, but we are talking about impact across limited interventions that we've been involved in. So I think the biggest issue is for the sector to actually come together and speak in one voice, which will then be heard by all the relevant stakeholders, especially policymakers. And it is already happening. So if you look at MNRE, there is a director today who's actively promoting this sector and is very keen to get scale. And I think, again, all the players who are working in this space need to, work with him to try and see how we can leverage on that connect to be able to achieve the results on the ground in terms of, rapid acceleration of DRE solutions and associated impact on the ground.
Okay. So as as we wrap our podcast, would you like to give any message to our listeners?
I mean, hopefully it's a message of hope saying that, this sector is still fairly nascent and it will take time for the sector to evolve and start growing. All the agencies which are playing the supporting role are committed to promoting DRE solutions for livelihoods and are actively looking to establish programs to ensure scale up in this sector. And therefore, sector stakeholders, especially the enterprises promoting such solutions, also need to remain positive. And, the end is quite near. I think we are at some kind of a turning point and we will see a fairly rapid acceleration of these solutions over the next 5 to 10 years if all the efforts that are being put together today bear fruit. So I think I would see this as a message of hope that this sector is very critical to address the energy needs in this country and also to ensure the transition to low carbon pathways. And we need to work together to be able to make this happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your words and also for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights. It has been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Muskan.